currently professor at the W.A.Franke College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana. He is definitely an accomplished scientist with nearly 200 peer-reviewed articles that have been cited over 15,000 times. His work get published in different journals, including Science, the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, but also in journals focusing on applied ecology, such as Journal of Wildlife Management, Journal of Applied Ecology, Ecological Applications, and so on. Of course, where he publishes has a lot to do with the type of research that he does. The main objective of his research is to understand how wildlife, such as ungulate herbivores, balance the cost of predation with the benefits of foraging, and how human activity influences this balance, and the conservation and management consequences to wildlife population dynamics. So his work on caribou provide insights into how we should proceed with caribou recovery. Mark, in fact, is scientific advisor for both the provincial and national recovery teams. He has also written a number of papers that provide wake-up calls for managers and more generally decision makers. So today's conference will be a critical review of recovery under the Species at Risk Act for wildlife caribou across Canada. His lecture will be followed by a 15-minute question period. You'll be able to ask questions using the video or by writing them at the top. You'll see a question mark at the top right of your screen, and then you can click and write your question, and we'll read them for Mark. So without further ado, Mark, please give us your...
Okay, can you hear me? I guess, okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Danielle, and to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I really enjoyed Manuela's talk this morning and the pioneering and innovative work they're doing in Norway with reindeer, wild forest reindeer, and mine's going to be a little different. Mine's going to be a little bit more of a policy focus here. So let's get started. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal lands upon which the University of Montana and Missoula operate. We are in the homeland of the Salish and Kootenai people who, right here, you can see really showing them right on the University of Montana grounds in Missoula, Montana. Now, you might ask, why would an American have anything to do with caribou from the lower 48? And this is a picture of Lolo Mountain, Lolo Peak, overlooking Missoula. Right behind Lolo Peak in the 1930s, caribou dwelled. So this photo is taken from the northwest part of Montana in the 1930s of some of the last forest mountain caribou in Montana. Okay, so this map from Bruce McClellan's review is a white paper review about a historic perspective on mountain caribou distribution and abundance, shows Missoula kind of right by the number 2 there. And so that's the caribou sighting I just told you about. And caribou historically occurred even further south of Missoula throughout the interior sort of cedar hemlock forests that extend from the Selkirks and Purcells into the Montana border. They disappeared from Montana sometime between the 30s and the 70s because of large-scale logging and forestry, just like we're observing across Canada today. And so it's both because of that and also my background. I was born and raised in Montreal, and I wish I was there in person to enjoy some good Quebecois hospitality in person instead of joining you from my home office like everybody else. But today we're going to be talking about caribou and Sarah. And so I'm going to just frame it a little bit with respect to that. I'm obviously a Western perspective. We're going to talk about recovery goals, critical habitat protection to date, and really address this question of whether there's been effective protection. Talk about some of the Section 80 and 11 and federal lands approaches in Jasper National Park, and try to sort of think about what's next in the future. As I said, I'm sort of providing a little bit of a view from the Westerner's perspective that will focus on boreal caribou populations in Alberta and British Columbia, and really a focus on mountain caribou, both southern mountain and a little bit on northern. So cowboy hat there. So now the preamble of the SARA, right? And Section 6 says this, right? The purpose of this act to prevent wildlife from being extirpated or becoming extinct, and to provide recovery of those species that are either extirpated, endangered, or threatened as a result of human activity, okay? Et cetera, et cetera. I emphasize human activity because I'm sure throughout this conference there will be all kinds of specters of climate change raised, and that climate change is causing caribou to extinct. There's nothing we should do about it anyway. But I point out that climate change is caused by humans. Therefore, human activity applies to climate change. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we think about the interpretation of SARA as we go forward. So, SARA works in theory like this. One sets a recovery goal. That leads to the identification of critical habitat necessary to achieve that goal, which is a logical way of thinking about habitat and recovery. Then there are recovery actions and implementation, such as in the action plans that go forward. Those lead ideally to effective protection and thus then to recovery and delisting. Now, it's sort of notable that in Canada, SARA is approaching 20 years old, and there's been, to my knowledge, one species that has made it the whole way through this process, and that is Phycella johnsoni, the Banff hot spring snail. And I'll return to them in a minute. Caribou are nowhere near there. So in terms of the recovery goals, step one, and I will be kind of contrasting, both Southern Mountain Caribou Recovery Plan and Boreal Caribou Recovery Plan. We'll start with Boreal. So the recovery goal is simple. We're going to save caribou everywhere, right? Conserved and recovered throughout Canada. And there's a distributional objective, population and distribution objective, is to maintain every single local population, all of them. And the number, whether it's 51 or 57, has varied depending on lumping or splitting. But the goal is to save everything. So we'll be coming back to that goal too in a minute. And likewise then we see this very broad map, and again the lumping and splitting has changed the actual numbers over time, but that's all save everything. That's the goal, okay? So then the Southern Mountain Caribou Recovery Plan has again a very similar goal, to achieve self-sustaining populations in all local population units, okay? It adds a new twist here, which is interesting, we'll come back to a little bit. But the recovery goal should result not in enough caribou to basically eat, right, to maintain treaty rights. That's a notable distinction between the Boreal Recovery Plan and the Southern Mountain Caribou Recovery Plan. And again, we'll sort of think about how we're doing with respect to that. It's not enough just to have 100 caribou around, and we have to have enough caribou to have a sustainable harvest to fulfill treaty obligations, which is a nice idea. I think you'll all agree. So let's see how we're doing with the recovery progress then. We'll focus first a little bit on Southern Mountain Caribou. So this is a figure from the recovery plan. And we can see that, in fact, we're not doing so well. There's been at least 4 to 6 high-profile extirpations. Basically, everything south of the Trans-Canada Highway is almost on the edge or has become extirpated, including the only population left in the United States. The South Selkirk occurred. We have South Purcell, Central Purcells. Monashees had 2 seen a couple years ago. Kinbasket's gone. Maline is gone. Banff is gone, etc. So in terms of the progress towards our goals, I have to kind of report we're not doing so well. So let's go then to the critical habitat necessary to achieve those goals, okay? How are we doing there? Okay, so again, what is critical habitat? By the Act, it is defined as that habitat that means that is necessary for the survival or recovery of a listed wildlife species, and that is identified as a species critical habitat and recovery strategy, okay? So it's explicitly tied to the recovery goal, right? That's the sort of conceptual framework, both within the Endangered Species Act here in the US and also in Canada, where the recovery goal is tied to the habitat necessary to achieve that goal. Makes sense, right? So destruction of critical habitat is defined in the Act in Section 58, right? Subject to this section, nobody shall destroy critical habitat of any listed species, blah, 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 if, this is the big if, most people, including environmentalist friends of mine, don't realize that's only if it's on federal land. Okay, so SARA only applies, strictly speaking, for terrestrial species to federal land. It applies for inland fisheries, such as West Slope cutthroat, through the authority of the Inland Fisheries Clause. Okay, so for terrestrial wildlife, critical habitat is only defined and protected under Section 58 for federal lands. This is going to pose a problem, you can imagine, because most of Canada isn't federal lands. Okay, oops, I just used my keyboard. Told myself not to do that. So myself and a lot of other people in this audience, I'm sure, were part of this huge team effort. It was probably the shining achievement of my career, probably in some ways, to help define critical habitat for, you know, 1 million square kilometers of Canada. Okay, not a small task. I really mean it. And so, what did we do in this? Again, I'm just providing a sketch. I don't want to go into this in detail, but you know, we used a combination of typical things like resource selection functions across Canada, and then we related population here, shown on the y-axis, recovery rates, recruitment rates, calves per 100 cows, as a function of the total disturbance, both anthropogenic and fire, right? That negative relationship yielded a probability then at which populations were, you know, going to be modeled to be viable or not. That was combined in a sort of Bayesian decision support framework, where we combine information about the status of the habitats with information from populations and population ecology from those populations with data. And we then predicted, well, what was the status of that population? So here's an example of west side of the Athabasca River in northern Alberta in the tar sands region. And it shows that the current range disturbance is about 70% of that caribou range is disturbed. The threshold identified by those Bayesian decision support system population models is that we need to be around 35%. This population is in trouble and has a very low probability of being perpetuating, right? It's got a high probability of becoming extirpated. So we did that across the country, and of course, then we mapped it, right? And this shows a map of the Little Smoky caribou range, the sort of test balloon for Canada, where about 96 to 8% of the caribou range is within 500 meters of human disturbance. If it kind of looks like one big blob, that's because it is. Those little slivers of polygons are the remaining undisturbed habitat. And so this approach is really, we were really proud of it at the time. I think it's got lots of innovative ideas. It yielded range-specific thresholds. It was probabilistic. It accounted for, in some ways, fire and the future scenarios where fire was going to happen. Besides this map here I'm showing you, it really isn't a mapping exercise. It was not a legally defined map of this is critical habitat. It gave a threshold, right? This either 65% disturbed or undisturbed, depending on if you're optimist or pessimist, at the range level. And in some ways, though, we're going to see that one interpretation is that anything within this buffer was already destroyed or disturbed, so have at it, right? So we'll see how that does. I'm going to see if I can move my little face so I can see my timer. There we go. Okay, so we'll see how we do with this definition of critical habitat. Okay, and that model was applied across the country, and we could see that, of course, the West shines like a beacon and is in trouble, and most of the populations in Alberta and northeastern BC are declining. Keep on touching my keyboard. Sorry. So let's look at Southern Mountain critical. So in the Southern Mountain, it was defined in a very different way, right? It was defined in this table S1 in the appendix with, I'm not going to belabor this, but there's northern group, central group, and southern groups of mountain caribou, and there was different definitions thereof, right, of core and matrix critical habitat. Those were, in essence, mapped. And now this map shows the differences between federal and non-federal lands. Remember what I told you earlier, that critical habitat's full might is only really operable on federal lands. Here, you can see in the Columbia North region in the south, on the sort of bottom left of the corner, there's actually some green areas mapped, right? That's tough to read, but those are critical habitat, legally defined and mapped in space. There's matrix habitat, which is also critical habitat, but we'll see, it's kind of unloved, is also mapped. Notice, though, in Jasper National Park and Banff National Park, critical habitat is not mapped, okay? So I'm going to come back to that later. So we've got, in some ways, some boring of best available information. There was some disturbance threshold borrowed from the boreal plan, but of course it was best available at the time, and there's a lot of questions about whether those boreal thresholds applied to mountain environments. There were lines on a map, but, and I forgot this point, not in Alberta, kind of over our dead body is what Alberta said, and not in federal lands, okay? But there was mapping and non-mapping, and again, there was this sort of confusion about all the different types of matrix and core habitats. And then there's this problem of the unloved matrix, right? Nobody really wants to get bent out of shape protecting matrix habitat, we'll see. And so we really have three different ways of actually identifying critical habitat right now in Canada for boreal. We have this probabilistic range level probability of disturbance threshold, right? We have lines on a map for Southern Mountain caribou in BC, but we have no lines on a map. We have this biophysical narrative, right, a description of what the critical habitat is in Alberta and in federal lands, the national parks. Okay, interesting. They could be viewed as hypotheses, for example, and we could see how we're doing on protecting those. So let's see if we've done so well. Effective protection, what do we find out here? Okay, so this is what I call, unfortunately, the lack of progress report. This was, SARA requires every 5 years a progress report to be presented on progress towards recovery activities, and this progress report really has 3 performance indicators. 1, range planning. The provinces were required to have range planning completed within 5 years. Oh, sorry, nobody did. Okay, performance indicator 2, population condition. Oh, sorry, all populations are still declining, and in fact, actually, there's been some of those same notable big extirpations that we saw in the southern mountain caribou. Performance indicator 3, habitat condition. 21 of the 51 ranges were above the threshold, and the trend wasn't good. But there wasn't much quantitative information given about trend, except in Appendix A. And to the author of Appendix A, I offer you my heartfelt thanks. So in Appendix A, there's lists of the percentages of each range disturbed by anthropogenic disturbance as defined by the recovery plan and critical habitat losses due to fire. The actual areas of those ranges were not given. So one does a little join between tables of publicly available sizes of those caribou ranges and the percentages, and you end up with this, right? Between 2012 and 2017, 17,000 kilometers of critical habitat for Canada or for caribou was destroyed in Canada, an average about 340 per caribou range, and that's just human-caused habitat destruction. That's not fire. And so again, this is the best available information across the country about how we're doing with critical habitat protection. Not so well. Thank you, Appendix A. Okay, so let's look at Southern Mountain. Okay, oops, actually they missed a 5-year statutory reporting deadline. So the SMC reporting deadline was due in 2019, that's 2 years ago. And there hasn't really been one, sorry about that, but it's okay, people did it for you. And one of the challenges in BC is of course this issue of private lands, right? Protecting critical habitat on non-federal lands is really, really difficult. Why? Because 94% of BC, for example, and we're going to dive into Southern Mountain here, are not, okay? So let's address this question of effective protection of Southern Mountain caribou. When we zoom in, then the other sort of wrinkle with jurisdictions across the country is, you know, it's a bit of hit or miss, but there's lots of jurisdictions without Species at Risk Act legislation. So BC doesn't have any, and this is what you find on the website. We're working on it, okay? So it really is a question of, well, what other policy instruments, if SARA can't apply on provincial lands, what other policy tools does BC have? And they have a number of acts that they say come to bear here. And the one that I want to focus a little bit on is FERPA, right? The Forest Range and Practices Act allows for the designation of 2 levels of protection, ungulate habitat areas, wildlife habitat areas and ungulate winter ranges. And through these government action regulations, GAR established really some of the most significant habitat protection in Canada. 22,000 square kilometers of southern mountain caribou habitat was effectively removed from logging by the BC governments in action of these GAR policies. So let's see how it did, right? So when we zoom in, my student Eric Palm and a number of us looked at the publicly available BC harvest data, the mapped critical habitat, and its protection under a variety of these different policy instruments in BC, and we saw, well, how did we do? We'll zoom into an area just by Wells Gray, right? And I'll sort of layer on the federally designated high or low elevation winter range critical habitat in the matrix range. You can see there it is there. Okay, so now we start to add in the protected by BC legislation polygons. You can see that critical habitat is bigger generally than what BC has protected, though significant. And then we can see the introduction of logging. So these are cut blocks that were put on the landscape prior to the legal designation of critical habitat. And you can see there's lots of them. This is what BC is good at. And a report just came out today about huge growth in old growth logging in BC that we'll return to thematically. So since 2014 then, how have we done in BC? And the answer isn't so good. There's been a number of cut blocks, generally not in BC's legislatively protected areas, but lots of cut blocks in high and low and matrix critical habitat within caribou ranges in this little sliver of Wells Gray. And in fact, when we zoom out, we actually see that since 2014, there's been an increase in the amount of logging in identified critical habitat in British Columbia to the tune of about 900 square kilometers, okay? So it's not working. Critical habitat isn't preventing logging and destruction of caribou critical habitat. by the provinces. Okay, and in fact, there's a talk on Thursday, May 6th by Rob Soroya on behalf of his co-authors, Mariana and Nagy Reese, looking at this trend across all of Western Canada. And I'll just put a highlight here. Go see his talk. It's great. It shows it's even worse, more or less, than I'm telling you, especially for boreal populations in northern BC, central BC. Okay, and so we zoom into southern BC then. Okay, well, BC's done a great job protecting habitat. We see some habitat recovery, despite we see this increase in logging. How are we doing? Well, the answer is it's probably not enough. You know, despite BC's best efforts to protect huge amounts of habitat, caribou populations are still being lost in the southern portion of southern mountain caribou in BC. Pretty much everything south of the Trans-Canada looks doomed, okay? So let's put it all together. Okay, so, well, you know, for the boreal, well, no, it's not protected. And for the southern mountain, well, not really either. And we'll focus on parks here in a minute. Okay, so, sorry, not effectively protected. Okay, so that's the answer there. So now let's think about what are these other policy instruments under SARA, like Section 80s and Section 11s. And of course, we'll evaluate Jasper in a minute. So the Section 80 emergency order, right, conceptually provides the federal government the ability to override provincial destruction of critical habitat when there is sufficient evidence that there is immediate threat to the species or recovery units. Okay, that allows the federal government to protect existing critical habitat, to identify new critical habitat, and to issue moratoria on resource development that threatens critical habitat. It's got some overlapping themes with Section 61, but Section 80 is what's been called the emergency order, okay? And so the order goes like this, right? The minister, the competent minister, as described in the Act, has to conclude that there are threats to the survival and recovery of my understanding, the recovery units, i.e. the local populations. They then make that recommendation to the federal cabinet minister for an order. They have to consult every other cabinet minister, and then cabinet accepts or declines this recommendation. And there's an incredible amount of cabinet and ministerial discretion in this process, as is wont in Canada. There's only been 2 Section 80s issued in Canada so far. One for sage grouse in southern Alberta that effectively protected an area of 1,700 square kilometers. Certainly important for sage grouse, and another one that protected 2 kilometers of western chorus frogs habitat in a suburb of Montreal. I think you will all appreciate these are postage stamps compared to the areas we're talking about required for caribou. So there has not been a Section 80 for caribou. We're going to see why, I think. And so, of course, there was a petition for an immediate threat assessment filed in British Columbia, and it had headlines like this, right? So federal government's mountain caribou imminent threat assessment, the ITA, Rebel Stokes socioeconomic concerns, right? And so when we look at this, right, well, what's the evidence for an immediate threat assessment? Well, in the period of the 5 years following the initiation of the 2014 recovery plan, all these populations went extinct. Populations continue to decline, and there's continued destruction of habitat. So, you know, my little pea brain puts all that together and says, boy, there's an immediate threat of extirpation of some of these units. So the decision was the opposite. So here's the 2018 imminent threat assessment. It's actually a very detailed view and read, and it has some pretty sobering statistics and information on it. However, the decision by the competent minister here in 2020 was indeed that there was no immediate threat to the species. This is the map used in the 2020 imminent threat analysis. And you even notice other strange things, like the population units have all been changed. They don't match up, especially the ones that are about to go or have gone extinct. So, you know, the purposes of that are a bit unclear, and I don't want to speculate. But either way, the decision was, no, they're not extirpated, despite the fact that there's these high-profile extirpations during the decision-making process about whether the ITA in Section 80 was warranted. And the decision, of course, was, you know, as it was going on, there was this sort of what I called fire sale on BC old-growth logging and caribou habitat that you can track yourself. This last March, the federal government declined to issue an emergency protection order for these caribou populations, again, despite all this sort of seemingly obvious evidence about it. And the argument was that this species doesn't face imminent threat. And that's interesting because I thought the goal of the recovery plan was the local population. So there seems to be some ministerial discretion here entering in about the actual recovery goal, which I'll come back to. And again, indeed, actually, this headline summarizes it. The federal government in Alberta and BC signs Caribou Conservation Plan amid protection order pressure. Sometimes headlines do get it right? And really the take-home message is this. So the hammer I showed you threatens the province into signing the Section 11 agreement, which we'll talk about in a minute. Alberta avoided legal order by signing the agreement, federal minister said. That's the hammer. And so let's look at the Section 11 agreements, okay? So with a critical eye here. What are they? Okay, so Section 11 of SARA provides legal instruments called conservation agreements. Again, the competent minister may, discretionary, right, after consultation, blah, 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 enter into a conservation agreement with any government in Canada to benefit a species at risk. And this is the kind of typical Canadian way, a little handshake, right? So let's see what these handshakes contain. Example 1, Boreal, right? So it was federal government, Alberta provincial government, signed last fall, right? So Minister Nixon in Alberta was very happy patting themselves on the back on it, but my colleague and co-author in this work, Sean Fluker, who is a professor of environmental law at University of Calgary, called it pie in the sky thinking. Why? So the strength of this is it was in some ways an implicit recognition of the failure of Alberta to follow the Species at Risk Act, and it kind of commits Alberta in some ways to this idea of habitat offsets. Talk about weaknesses. It was only 5 years. 100-year timeline, right? Let's talk about happiness in heaven. We'll never see the consequences of this partnership agreement because it committed it to a 100-year timeline. I mean, a pause for laughter in some ways. It's hard to imagine that working. There's zero commitment in the agreement to actually meet critical habitat targets or to indeed actually complete range plans as set out by the Boreal Recovery Plan. It resumes subsurface mineral leases. It basically commits to really nothing except wolf control. And it has lots of language about convening, collaborating, engaging, and planning the plan, which is sort of a bit disturbing. When we dig into it, actually, it seemingly was triggered by the Nova Gas Pipeline agreement through the Little Smoky Range. This was signed in the same week as the Section 11 agreement. And this is a quote from Seamus O'Regan, the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources, saying we want to get projects done and get stuff out of the ground and do good things, the typical Canadian way. Okay, so this Canadian Energy Regulatory Act governs this regulatory decision. This isn't a pre-Harper problem. This is new legislation. Underneath the auspices of this act, they approved the construction of the Nova Gas line through critical habitat, largely because it was already in disturbed and destroyed habitat within the buffer. They expressly ignored SARA, and they even said, well, because there's no Section 80 agreement, we can't see any clear evidence that this pipeline would harm caribou, right? Under the logic, messed up anyway, so why bother? And I encourage you to read the full detailed analysis of Sean's on his Alberta log thing. And then again, it assumes that Nova Gas can effectively restore 3,800 hectares of caribou habitat, which we haven't done yet in Canada effectively. Okay, so that's pretty depressing, but not surprising in some ways. It highlights an area I think there could be policy improvements, strengthening the inclusion of SARA into other federal government agency bodies like energy regulation. But this paper summarizes everything I just said, right? Extirpation despite environmental assessments, they're failing caribou. Okay, so that's the Alberta example. Let's go to example number 2 for the Central Group. 2 new signatories here, Soto First Nation and West Moberly First Nation. And here's a picture of, and I will call him Honorable Chief Roland Wilson, holding the caribou antlers at the agreement. So the strengths of this is it's 30 years. Okay, that's a 30-year commitment. Maybe some habitat will come online then. It explicitly addresses Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution's requirement for Indigenous consultation, and more than that, partnership, true partnership. And it actually specifies concrete habitat protection, habitat deferrals, habitat restoration, and outlines the framework for an Indigenous protected and conservation area. The cons to it, however, is it really depends on more wolf control, right? There's huge political opposition locally. Coal mining, everything you can see the brown areas there, that's the IPCA. That's real habitat protection. Everything else is basically the same as the Southern Mountain Caribou Section 11 agreement between Alberta, BC, and Canada. It's open for business. Coal mining is open for business. And really, it's what this maps out is one caribou population will be saved. in the Central Mountain Group. Okay, that's it. And when we dig into that, this paragraph shows from in a review paper, a revision paper by Clayton Lamb, shows that big expansion, park expansion in the Clins-des-Arcs population. Everything else is largely unprotected still, and you saw how well unprotected critical habitat was being fared in BC, right? So everybody calls this a great example, but I see an example of one caribou population surviving. That's it. Okay, so let's look at Jasper next, right? Where, back to the original purposes of SARA, the full weight of the Species at Risk Act comes to bear. So SARA section 58 subsection 2 says for any critical habitat that is identified in a national park, a description of that habitat must be published on the Canada Gazette. Now I took the slide out because I was worried about time, but there is an example of a map for Phycella johnsoni, the Banff Springs snail. It is mapped critical habitat of the habitats needed for recovery for that species. So Parks Canada has mapped and explicitly identify critical habitat for other endangered species. Let's see what they do with caribou. So here's the description from the Gazette that is also referenced in the Multi-Species Action Plan. I'll zoom in so you can read it in its detail. It says it's already defined in the Southern Mountain Recovery Plan. Oh, wait a minute, I showed you the Southern Mountain Recovery Plan. Remember, there was no map, no mapped critical habitat. Let's look at it a bit more. We dig in here to this figure. There's no critical habitat map. Now, there is no requirement for the federal or any other government to explicitly map critical habitat on federal or any other lands. But I just told you the precedent in some ways is set that it was mapped for Banff Springs hot snail. And here we have it mapped in BC, but not in the federal government, right? So why is that? Let's look. Look at the description. Here's Appendix C of the SMC Recovery Plan showing biophysical attributes, right? Here they are, high elevation summer ranges for calving. Okay, we'll come back to that, okay? So I wonder if this might have something to do why critical habitat is not mapped in Jasper. So at the same time of all this stuff going since 2014, there was a report concluded or conducted evaluating the effects of the Marmot Basin ski area on critical habitat for caribou in Jasper. The author, of course, was the architect for the Boreal Caribou Woodland Recovery Critical Habitat team, Fiona Schmiglo and her colleagues, and it showed that in some ways, Marmot Basin, the ski area, was already having a negative effect on caribou summer habitat, and the expansion would significantly reduce calving habitat quality, especially. So here we have a biophysical critical habitat description in the recovery plan that's also referenced in the Gazette, with a report saying that an expansion of a ski area in the federally protected national park would destroy that critical habitat. Okay. It turns out that the Jasper's decision was to approve this ski area expansion, and the order of events here are somewhat interesting, okay, because the report was not disclosed until after the decision to approve the ski area expansion occurred, and I use that word explicitly. I don't know why that was the case, right? And of course, this was also coincident with an outpouring of support from 100 current and recently retired biologists across the country who worked for Parks Canada, protesting the firing of this resource con manager from Jasper National Park, who commissioned said study on critical habitat destruction by the Marmot Basin ski area. And so, you know, what happened then, and there's a parallel track with the Moline Road decision, but now we don't have caribou in Jasper, right? We've lost the Moline herd. The Tonquin herd is down to 10 or fewer females, and the Brazeau population is functionally extinct as well. And so, you know, this is the former superintendent for Jasper speaking out about the failure of Parks Canada and the federal government to protect caribou in Jasper. And there's long been a culture at the senior level in Parks Canada of trying to keep the minister's office from hearing too many angry stakeholders, so as to avoid losing local control over day-to-day management decisions. That culture lost us the Moline herd. These are wise words from Kevin. I wish they came perhaps a little earlier in his career before he retired, but I think they summarize one of the reasons, perhaps I'm speculating, why critical habitat wasn't mapped in Jasper National Park. So even in the lands where the full might of SARA is supposed to protect and identify critical habitat for species, we see the same kinds of shenanigans, honestly, that we see elsewhere in caribou range. And in fact, this is continuing today, despite Honorable Minister Wilkinson's announcement of their interest in reintroducing through captive breeding caribou in Jasper National Park. Number one, I noticed that that is an admission of failure, right? Captive breeding is only really a useful option when you failed at other things. And the second thing I note is that they are going to be potentially talking about reintroducing caribou to habitat that is further degraded and currently not protected, right? So there's current moves afoot in Jasper to open and expand backcountry recreation in what can only be described in Table C of the Southern Mountain Caribou Recovery Strategy as critical habitat for caribou. So when we sort of wrap this up, what would I conclude? I would conclude SARA is failing on caribou federal lands, right? There's the same sorts of political pressure to avoid bad news inside national parks as there is outside national parks. There's an incredible amount of ministerial discretion and suppression of science that's potentially consistent with failure to protect critical habitat, and there's a real resistance for some reason within federal lands to map critical habitat for one species, caribou, while doing it for another one, right? And it shows in some ways that there's no cost administratively or bureaucratically to avoid protecting critical habitat even in a national park, unless, this is the irony, you're another ski hill that cuts down endangered whitebark pine. So I can only imagine what the owners of the Lake Louise ski hill feel about all this when they've been fined $2 million for cutting down whitebark pine, while the park next door approved an expansion in critical habitat for another endangered species. Okay, so this is a paper Danielle and I wrote on a bar outside here in a patio having a beer when he was on sabbatical here in Missoula, and I think it still is pretty true, sadly. And so, what can we think about the future? What's the future for SARA? So, the threats to caribou habitat haven't really changed, okay? It's unsustainable logging of primary forests, mostly in Western Canada, and unsustainable oil and gas destruction of critical habitat, okay? And again, we just saw a report just today in CBC about that with old growth logging in British Columbia, okay? So nothing's changed there, right? And I feel like, nothing we like more as Canadians, and I am both now Canadian and American. There's nothing more we do that we like as Canadians than making fun of America, right? And here shows a nice banana republic for the US. But really, I think it's time to sort of get a bit critical of ourselves in Canada. And it has to do with this, right? This famous sort of biblical phrase about our identity as Canadians. We are hewers of wood, miners of whatever, and drillers of whatever. Energy is the engine of Canada's economy, right? And nothing in critical habitat protection to date has done anything to slow down energy development on caribou habitat. I showed you that Nova Gas pipeline example. That's just but one small example, okay, of the failure to stop energy. We're also hewers of wood. This is a paper showing the relationship between the dollar ratios between our two countries and the amount of area harvested. And this analysis showed that the implementation of critical habitat protections at the federal level had zero effect on logging rates in mapped identified caribou habitat across Canada. Okay, and so this icon, this little cartoon, I worked with a graphic designer, really illustrates the problem. Here we are 10 years later, right? Just about after the 2012 recovery plan for caribou for boreal, and we're still doing the same things. We're failing to protect critical habitat for caribou. And all we're doing is killing wolves, right? And I say that and being in the thick of it myself over the last decade, evaluating the effects of wolf recovery. This map here from Rob's PNAS paper, all those populations in red, right, are experiencing and are experiencing pretty broad scale wolf control. That's it. That's what these Section 11 agreements are. That's the main thing you take away from a legal analysis of the Section 11 agreements, is that's the only thing that the federal government is really holding provinces' feet to the fire, okay? Right? And then when we really think back to the ministerial discretion evidently about the recovery goal itself with respect to the Section 80 immediate threat assessment, it really does call into question whether our initial goals in the recovery strategies were well thought out, right? Remember, they were simply put to save everything. We are abject failures at that, right? Both in the boreal populations and through especially southern mountain caribou. We are failing to meet our recovery objectives under SARA, okay? And the reasons are for the ones I talked about. And so this leads me to what I'm starting to call injurious neglect, mainly because people really don't like the word triage. But right now, politicians are doing triage for us, right? And there's not much, in my opinion, effective science to guide landscape level triage and evaluation of recovery goal objectives for caribou in Canada. And the result is where we are going to see caribou persist in the future is wherever, and this is the Central Group's Section 11 agreement, what it tells us is where there is a passionate and dedicated First Nation advocate. That Klinzezaa population will be, in some ways, one of the only viable ones left in the Central Mountain Group. Because of the federal government? No. Because of the BC government? No. Because of the leadership and vision of two small First Nations, West Mobley and Soto First Nation. That's a form of triage. That's what's going on right now in Canada. And so, how do I sleep at night when I think about causes for optimism? Well, one of my favorite unknown and unused sections of the Act is Section 64, compensation. The minister may provide fair and reasonable compensation for any business or person for losses suffered as a result of any of these things I just said. 58, 60, or 61 all have to do with federal oversight on critical habitat protection on provincial lands, and then, of course, the Section 80s. I'd like to see this exercised a bit. This mechanism, habitat protection arrangements, for example, under the ESA, provides private landowners and industry huge amounts of money to offset the financial costs of critical habitat protection for endangered species here in the United States. This has not been used yet, and I wonder why. If I was industry, I would be very interested in getting financially compensated for stopping destruction of critical habitat, and nobody really knows about this. Like, pretty interesting act, pretty well thought out. I also see a huge future, as alluded to in the Section 11 agreement for Central Mountain Group, of overlap with IPCAs, right? And again, I'm being pretty blunt, but I don't see really much future in BC except in areas where there is a dedicated and interested Indigenous partner. And this map shows some sketches of some of the IPCAs under consideration right now in Canada to meet the Beyond Aichi targets. And I think that these offer a vision to the future. Note, they're all in the north. And so I feel like that's a vision to the future for a hopeful view, optimistic view that the north somehow avoids the mistakes of the south, right? So IPCAs are a shining case for optimism. And if they can be woven into Section 11 agreements, or potentially Section 80s, they could be very powerful at conserving caribou. But look at that, that's not all caribou populations. So even these are a form of triage or non-injurious neglect, okay? Another one, and I was really impressed by Amanda Martin's talk this morning that touched on this, right? Like, we cannot see the forest for the caribou. Caribou are about carbon and biodiversity, and Canada's ability to meet the Paris Agreement and other international agreements are really going to be driven by its ability to keep carbon in the ground and stop developing the boreal forest, right? So I feel like we need more synergy and overlap between other federal and international policy agreements to foster some sort of strategic triage in the application of those ideas to caribou conservation, okay? And I feel, again, there's a talk later this week by Julie on the IUCN's, last name Julie, hope I pronounced that right, on the IUCN's view here. But Canada signed these international agreements, UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and it really is questionable to me whether we are going to, as a country, be able to meet those. And the example I see is UN DRIP, right? So the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Canada was kind of dragged kicking and screaming into signing that. And one of the ways that we were was by public shaming at the international stage. And so I feel like public shaming of Canada at the international stage with respect to the IUCN might actually get somewhere. Because certainly it looks to me like the last 5 years of critical habitat haven't done much, right? And so, lastly, I would say if any of you, and maybe it's just because I submitted my grades and I'm in a bit of that kind of mood at the end of the semester, but the lack of progress report, the missed deadlines, the failure to sort of comply with SARA, I would just say that, these are the kinds of things that would get you audited in tax season, right? As an independent citizen in a law-abiding country, if you failed to submit your tax requirements and documents on time, you'd probably be audited. And I wonder if that might not be a fruitful endeavor to engage the federal government's Office of the Auditor General in. Okay, so to conclude, optimistically, we'll be left probably at the end of the century with fewer than half of the caribou populations we currently have. The current policy, in my mind, naively assumes we can recover it all. And I think we're seeing that not happen. We're not. We're extirpating populations and logging their habitat as soon as they're extirpated. And I would say that Canadians' form of federalism applies also to transfer payments with healthcare, is really hindering from SARA from working on private land, on provincial lands. And the lack of provincial legislation for SARA isn't really the answer, because if you look at Ontario and see the hundreds of exceptions to their own provincial species at risk permits for destruction of critical habitat, we can't really, based on evidence, trust the provinces to do it either, honestly. And to me, I really do think that the two optimistic hopes here are looking for ways to strengthen existing federal legislation, right? Like, we've got to do better at environmental assessments with SARA, listed species, and for looking for overlap with Indigenous conservation and protected areas. Without overlap with other policy instruments, it looks like SARA by itself is largely ineffective so far. So with that, I acknowledge the co-authors on our SARA-related work here, Sean Fluker from University of Calgary Law School, my PhD student Eric Palm, and Dr. Aaron Jacob from Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. I benefit from discussions about these things with many, many people, many of whom who disagree with me, and I list them there. So with that, I'll take questions, Danielle.
Thank you, Mark. Very interesting talk. The first question comes from Phil McLaughlin. Phil asked, caribou and Banff snails are subjected to the same legislation, but ecological scales of persistence are so different. Wouldn't provincial or territorial legislation with teeth be better than anything federal, so extinction is defined at provincial scale?
Yeah, I think I get your question, Phil. I mean, a couple comments. So, the Banff Springs hot snail lives in 4 or 5 hot pools in Banff, and certainly it's very easy to identify the critical habitat for that species. So I think that's what you're talking about with respect to scales. It's that pond, it's that hot spring, so you fence it. So yes, that's easy. Now, the thing is I don't think that would have been supported if, for example, the Banff Springs hot snail lived on Alberta provincial lands, because Alberta is in the same sort of boat as BC without having Effective Species at Risk Act legislation. So while federal legislation is designed to, in some of the subsections of the Act with respect to critical habitat, sections 58 and so on, are designed to interact with provincial Species at Risk Act legislation. So in theory, as you say, could be strengthened. I think one only has to look to Ontario to see the trouble that a provincial government will go through to writing themselves permits to destroy critical habitat. So, I suppose my conclusion is no. I don't think provincial legislation by itself, given those exclusionary exemption permits in Ontario, are going to be enough to protect critical habitat.
Thanks, Mark. The second question is from Jillian Chow Fraser. Well, first, thank you for your talk. What would be your recommendation to Minister Wilkinson for the future of woodland caribou and the implementation of SARA?
Ooh, very good question. And, first off, I would say not to take advice from any one person, right? Any one science. Tony Sinclair always said, never trust one scientist, trust a bunch of them. And so I would convene a special scientific task force to advise the minister on that very question. And one of the things that how federalism works in Canada, really, or we can look to healthcare payments for this, is to put more money behind it in exchange for the things that they're trying to get the provinces to do to protect critical habitat. Yes, there's been some money involved, and I don't want to denigrate how much, but we are actually talking about hundreds of millions, and in fact, billions of dollars in potential lost revenue between some of these sectors. And so I feel like, a lot of our work done in the science of the boreal woodland caribou critical habitat work was focused entirely on ecological questions. But I would say there needs to be a separate body of the socioeconomic advisors in science done as well to evaluate the socioeconomic costs and mechanisms for incentivizing conservation under Canada's loose federalism, right? So Wilkinson, I want to admit, Honorable Wilkinson has a very difficult job, but so far I feel like, my suggestion for an audit might, I hope, trigger some interest in convening some bodies of science advisors to figure out how to improve these. Sorry, Danielle.
Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, it's okay. I think I was finishing up.
No, I couldn't hear anything. Sorry.
That's right.
Were you done?
Yes. Hope that
Okay.
helped, Jillian.
Okay.
I see someone there.
The next question is a video one.
Oh, hello.
Hi. So thanks for your talk, Mark. Despite the depressing material, it was really interesting. The last NACW ended with a call to action and stopping planning to plan from the new generation, which had a similar but less technical message as you hear today, 2 years later. Do you think there's been any short-term changes in action or thought patterns, or do we continue to do more of the same? And how can we actually push progress forward?
Well, that's a very good question. Is this Melanie?
It is. Hi.
Oh, hi, Melanie. Nice to see you. Sorry, I didn't see your name. Yeah, one would hate to have that be the concluding remark at this conference, wouldn't you? Right? Because that would be history repeating itself. And it seems like from my talk, the only thing we learn from history is that one cannot learn, or humans are incapable of learning from history. And so to be a little less facetious in the answer to that, I would say yes, the Section 11 agreement with the First Nations I mentioned, Soto and West Moberly, that to me is a significant development in the last couple of years since the last NACW. That could be a blueprint for effective protection. Now, one out of, like in that Central Mountain Group agreement, only 1 or 2 of those 5 populations are actually effectively protected. That's triage. So I feel like we better get used to that, because that's actually how this is probably going to roll out legislatively if Section 11 agreements with First Nations are haphazard in their prioritization and their development, which the IPCAs have been, right? First Nations who are willing and interested in discussing IPCAs with the federal government are getting somewhere. And that's not, in essence, strategic either. That's just happening according to whichever groups show up first at the table to ask. So I would say that's room for optimism for me. That really is. So I hope that
Thanks,
that
Mark.
becomes a theme of the conference. Yeah.
Barb Anderson asked, can you expand upon your unloved matrix reference?
Good question. Yeah. Well, I think about the red pill, blue pill, right, in the Matrix movies. But in the context of critical habitat, right, we've got core, high elevation. Well, everybody can get behind core. Core sounds important. What is matrix? The actual choice of our terminology, I think, influences the implementation. And when we looked at the rates of logging of core and matrix, we actually see that there's a lot more matrix logged. So that's what I meant by unloved matrix. It seems just by very virtue of the terminology, calling something matrix denotes it's unimportant. It's just the stuff that holds other things together. It's not as important. And so I feel like part of SMC's and ECCC's sort of revision plans to identify and update the definitions of critical habitat, probably need to think a little bit more about more compelling language, right? Nobody feels bad about cutting down matrices, but people feel bad about cutting down core habitat. So maybe it's just a language issue, Barb, but good question.
So Alexandre Beauchemin asked, you showed Sarah being strictly written. We can see that implementation is the flaw. So how do you see it improved with such a small political for real protection?
Yeah, and again, I hesitate to feel like I have all the answers, because I certainly don't. And so I would convene a group of experts to answer this question, not just me. But it does cause reflection of what the way federalism works in Canada, right? The way federalism works in Canada is Canada attaches money to agreements for the provinces to deliver, for example, healthcare, or for example, COVID management, or things like that. And it has to come with money. And then the only carrot, really, the federal government's mostly about carrots in Canada, not so much about sticks, right? That hammer, the Section 80 hammer, the federal government's very unwilling to wield that, I think, for reasons that are illustrated by the recent Supreme Court decision about the federal government's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as the Paris Agreement. If you recall, there were several provinces that sued the federal government's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, saying that indeed that was actually a provincial authority because of those are provincial resources. The Supreme Court erred in the side of the federal government But I feel like that was a risky court case for the federal government. And I feel like the federal government's probably very risk averse with respect to going down that path with critical habitat Section 80 hammers. And so then what are you left with? You're left with carrots, right? So if you got no sticks, all you have is carrots. And so I feel like attaching more and bigger pots of money to incentivize caribou conservation, for example, Section 64, the compensation part of SARA, could be and probably is the only effective instrument that the federal government has here to concede.
Thanks, Mark. 2 more minutes for questions. So a question from Guelph. Tom Nuds asked, why would we keep ecology and socioeconomic task force separate when we have the structured decision-making toolbox available?
Great question, Tom. And Tom was my undergrad thesis advisor, so wonderful I wish I was having a beer with you as usual. But no, I guess I didn't mean to imply that they should be separate. In fact, I said I would think they would need to be explicitly integrated. And I actually think that, I guess to be a little bit more, try to have some clarity there, what's come to sort of, what I kind of think about is that if there isn't more science done about the socioeconomic costs, then who drives the information about socioeconomic costs? Industry and politicians. And quite frankly, they're pretty bad at overblowing those economic benefits. And a recent coal report out of BC showed that the promised economic costs or benefits of coal mining, for example, are never realized. They're always overblown by about double, and they're almost never evaluated after the fact. So I feel like we need the same sort of credible scientific information to evaluate those socioeconomic costs, and not to simply rely on industries themselves and or governments to tell us how great all those things are, because they never actually turn out to be that great. The full economic, benefits of things like Site C or coal mines aren't ever fully realized by Canadian society, right? And there was a really great report on that recently that surprised me. So I feel like with that kind of socioeconomic information put into a structured decision-making toolbox and being open to reevaluating the recovery goals, I feel like we could actually get somewhere with strategically prioritizing conservation of caribou in Canada to achieve a bunch of different objectives.
Thanks, Mark. I'm very sorry for other people. I know that always your talks always lead people to ask very good questions, but I'm afraid that the other ones will have to contact you privately, because in 2 minutes, we'll resume the journal oral presentations. So I invite you to select a room associated with the next presentation that you wish to attend. Thank you again, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you again, Danielle.